All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here today. I'm delighted, always delighted to welcome my friend and neighbor, Dr. Minxin Pei. Minxin Pei is the Tom and Margot Pritzker 72 Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. In 2019, he was the inaugural Library of Congress Chair on U.S.-China relations. Prior to joining Claremont McKenna College in 2009, he was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and served as its director of the China program from 2003 to 2008. He was an opinion columnist for Bloomberg and the author of From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in China and the Soviet Union in 1994, China's Trapped Transition, The Limits of Developmental Autocracy in 2006, China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay in 2016, The Sentinel State, Surveillance and the Survival of Dictatorship in 2024, and just this week, coming out 2025, The Broken China Dream, How Reform Revived Totalitarianism, which is going to be the subject of today's remarks. Dr. Pei received his PhD in government at Harvard and taught at Princeton University from 1992 to 1997. He is the recipient of the National Fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and Robert McNamara Fellowship of the World Bank and the Olin Faculty Fellowship. His op-eds and columns have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, Nikkei Asian Review, Project Syndicate, The Economist, Bloomberg, and many other outlets. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Minxin Pei to give us some remarks about his latest book, The Broken China Dream. Welcome, Minxin, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, both for giving me this opportunity and for your very, very generous introduction. The book is now available on Amazon and in bookstores. It took me roughly about 2 years to write it. The book tries to address three very important issues. The first is that China began to sort of reform and open itself up to the outside world in 1979. How come that more than 40 years after China embarked on this journey to reform and opening, we had the return of a form of totalitarian rule? I have to say that Chinese leaders themselves did not expect this. Certainly, we did not expect this. So that's a very important puzzle. The crux of this issue is really a reflection on Deng Xiaoping's strategy of economic development under one-party rule. Is there a connection between Deng's so-called new authoritarian development model and the revival of totalitarian rule in China? So that is the first research question, or the big question. The second is the question is the relationship between economic development and the emergence of a more liberal, open, democratic society. Because over the last 40 years, China's economic development has been one of the fastest, most impressive in the world. The standard of living in China has risen beyond anybody's expectations. But we have not really seen the equivalent change in political development, in political liberalization. I have to say the society as a whole has been really modernized, but the political system remains firmly as one of Leninist and now totalitarian rule. So the research question here is, can we actually reform a totalitarian regime through economic change? Because the nature of the regime of the Chinese Communist Party in the late 1970s, that is before Deng's reform and opening, was a totalitarian regime. After 40 plus years, it has not really been reformed politically. So the question is, can this kind of system be reformed? The last question concerns China's relationship with the outside world. When China opened its doors, the Western world embraced China, expecting China to be not only a freer, more prosperous society internally, but also a much more responsible, engaged, and constructive member of the international order. Obviously, that has not happened, at least to the extent that Western countries expected. Instead, what we are seeing today is some form of a new Cold War between China and the US. So that is another very big question. So if I have time, I will try to address all of them, but let me just start with the first question. That is a reflection on Deng Xiaoping's neo-authoritarian development model and the revive of totalitarian rule under Xi Jinping. Is there a connection? My bottom line assessment is yes, there is a connection. We're not saying that the reemergence of totalitarian rule is inevitable or unavoidable, but it is a high probability event. This starts with the fundamental objective of Deng Xiaoping's economic reform and opening to the outside world. We have not really been focusing on this issue for a while. In some quarters, there were ideas that would suggest that Deng Xiaoping was trying to turn China into a capitalist society. That was not his objective, his goal. His goal has been very consistent. Capitalism was the means. The preservation of China's one-party rule was and has always been his goal. So we have to understand today's China by placing at the back of our mind this overall political objective of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening, because this objective actually forecloses many options that China could have embraced in the last 40 years. Now, once we keep this objective in mind, then you can understand why many of the important institutional reforms, we're not even talking about democratizing reforms, but reforms that could have taken within the Communist Party that might have played a more important role in preventing the return of totalitarian rule. Those reforms did not take place. So the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping did seriously try to change how the Communist Party itself operated. Because as a victim of Mao's totalitarian rule, one of Deng Xiaoping's objectives, and of course that's an objective shared by his colleagues, was to prevent the return of another Mao-like figure that could terrorize the party and traumatize China again. But the problem with the reforms that Deng Xiaoping pursued within the Communist Party, the so-called institutionalization, those reforms were vague, were unenforceable, and worst of all, Deng himself violated personally many of these rules. So let me explain what I mean. They're vague in the sense that a lot of rules did not specify what exactly those rules meant, and did not actually put in the details. Let me give you just one example. It's commonly misunderstood, I would say misunderstood, that Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues in the 1980s explicitly set term and age limits for senior leaders, there was no age limits whatsoever. So that was because Deng Xiaoping and his sort of veteran comrades did not want age limits to be applied to them. So they were really, if you look at all the rules, age limits applied to lower level officials, but not to the most senior leaders. And that created the problem later on. Because today, Xi Jinping did not remove any age limits. He just removed a term limit. So now let's look at term limits. Term limits were not spelled out with respect to positions within the Chinese Communist Party. The only term limit was the presidency or the state chairman, which is a largely symbolic figure. So that's sort of, you can see that the kind of institutional measures that could prevent the return of a Mao-like figure were relatively weak. And even more problematically, these rules did not lay out enforcement mechanisms. First of all, these rules could be changed very quickly, very easily. The Chinese Constitution is very easy to change. So you could remove term limit later on, the term limit on the state chairman. But what happens if somebody tries to violate them? Because there was this very important document that explicitly prohibited personality cult. There are two problems. One is that it does not mean personality cult. Well, how do you define personality cult? And today, obviously, we see personality cult in China with so much propaganda efforts lavished on Xi Jinping. But even worse, even worse, this document does not say that violators could be punished by blah, 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 by some XYZ. No enforcement sort of measures. And most problematic of Deng Xiaoping's so-called institutionalizing reforms was that they could not be enforced because Deng Xiaoping himself was dead set against both democratization within the party and democratization outside the party. So you don't have a third party, an independent force, such as the courts, such as elections, such as civil society, such as opposition party, that could enforce these rules. So in other words, most of his rules were really sort of a house of cards if they had to be challenged. And we saw that they were indeed a house of cards when Xi Jinping systematically and relatively effortlessly dismantled them. So how come? So those rules held for about roughly 20 years. That's the remarkable aspect of this house of cards. It endured for 20 years after the Tiananmen crackdown. So roughly from 1992 to 2012, you had actually a pretty stable and apparently institutionalized system working in China. And because of that, we had very experienced, highly respected scholars on China proclaiming that the Chinese system had been institutionalized. There's a form of authoritarian resilience there. Looking back, at that time, I was very skeptical because historically, no dictatorship can enforce its own rules. So why should China be exceptional? Reflecting on that period, my conclusion, and that's in the book, is that it's not the rules themselves, but there was a very delicate balance of power at the very top. So for about 20 years, you had the very top of the Chinese regime, a set of individuals and their factions that were more or less equally matched. So, in fact, to use an international relations analogy, China had a balance of power, a multipolarity at the top. And that prevented one faction from gaining dominance So that faction had to cooperate, share power with all other factions. And that explained this relative, was this period of relative stability within China. So that's, I think, so when you look at Deng Xiaoping's reforms, he made two very important mistakes. One was very partial institutional reforms that could not be enforced, that could be easily overturned in the future by a would-be totalitarian ruler. The other was his dead set, his firm opposition to any democratic reforms. And those reforms prevented a third party, civil society, opposition parties, or legal system to perform any checks and balances against a would-be dictator. So that is now. So how does new authoritarian model would so this would the previous part explained why within the party the rise of a Mao-like figure in the form of Xi now was a likely outcome. But when you look at sort of another issue, that is why why Xi was, besides the sort of the fragility of the rules themselves, how could Xi get rid of his political opponents so easily? And that has to do with corruption in China. One fundamental flaw of Deng Xiaoping's new authoritarian development model was that he did not foresee the extent of corruption that could happen under one-party rule when the economy grew very fast. In retrospect, that was unavoidable because power without constraint, without any form of accountability, would lead to pervasive corruption. So in the post-Tiananmen period, China's ruling elites were able to convert their unconstrained political power throughout the system, from top to bottom, into immense personal wealth through corruption mostly. And so these elites were themselves very vulnerable because they actually committed crimes. During the Tiananmen period, because of this mutual security pact struck among elites as a result of their mutual interests, as a result of this fragile balance of power, they did not have to face consequences. Of course, there were periodic campaigns against corruption, but those were mostly for show. However, once you have a system in which many, if not most, elites are corrupt or potentially vulnerable to anti-corruption investigations, then it's very easy for somebody like Xi Jinping to use anti-corruption, to weaponize anti-corruption investigations to systematically get rid of his political rivals or enemies. And that's exactly what happened after Xi Jinping came to power. So when you look at how sort of really effortlessly he turned China's sort of this multipolar system, or this balance of power, or this collective leadership into one-man show. So that actually had to sort of it's often said that Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping were polar opposites. But when you look at this, Xi Jinping actually must thank Deng Xiaoping for paving the way for his eventual rise. So I call Xi Jinping is an accident waiting to happen in terms of now the third issue related to this is about China's economics development, because what we've seen is that for about 20 years, the Chinese economy grew very fast. But starting in 2012, the economy has been consistently declining in terms of growth. Now China is growing probably around, official figure is still 5-6%. Real figure likely is a lot lower. So why did that happen? I would say that is because of another fundamental flaw in Deng Xiaoping's one sort of a economic development under one-party rule. Deng Xiaoping embraced capitalism out of desperation. He did not really embrace capitalism because of ideological conviction. He saw capitalism as the only available economic instrument to save communism. He did not expect that the incentive for reforming the Chinese economy would progressively decline. The Communist Party embraced capitalism in the 1980s was because it had to. It had very strong political incentives. That was a survival strategy. However, as capitalism began to work its magic in China, the economic conditions sort of consistently improved. The Communist Party gained performance legitimacy, but paradoxically, its incentive for reforming the economy would also decline. And as a result, over time, you would have economic stagnation in terms of economic reform. That actually happened even before Xi Jinping came along. And the final point I want to make regarding the return of totalitarian rule is that when you look at political changes in China very carefully, one fact standing out: the underlying institutions of totalitarianism in China really had not been dismantled. In the case of Deng Xiaoping, he did not touch them. He did not end the party state. He did not extract the party from the state. He did not relinquish the party's control over the information. He did not get the party out of the military. I think the most important changes with respect to dismantling totalitarian rule was really in the economic sphere. That is, the economy became much more market-oriented, and the private sector has become the most important element in the Chinese economy, contributing something like 65 to 70%. So this is a major change. But even in that respect, the state remains a critical player because the state controls the so-called commanding heights of the economy, finance in particular. So you would say it is a sort of partial dismantling of totalitarianism in the economic sector. Ideology, I think that in that respect, totalitarianism has really lost its appeal. But for the most part, I would say 75% of the totalitarian system that really matters in terms of maintaining control has basically remained reformed or intact. So that makes it really easy for a future ruler who would like to revive the system to actually sort of revive it. My analogy is that this is like flipping a power switch. So don't merely turn off the switch. The machinery, the apparatus is there. Now, somebody like Xi Jinping who would like to sort of get this machinery, this apparatus going again up, all he needed to do is to flip the switch. And of course, that worked. So this is now, I think, so this part I hope that so my explanation would give us a better idea of why so this so the revival of authoritarian rule was relatively easy under Xi Jinping. And I have to emphasize that this outcome was not anticipated by Chinese leaders or by ordinary Chinese people, and least of all by most Western countries that have engaged in trying to opening China. So now this is a perfect segue to the second question: why high rates of economic development in China has not brought us political democratization in China. So first, let's just take a look at the so-called modernization theory, because the modernization theory in our daily conversation, so for most people, seems to predict that economic development would lead to democracy. In fact, this is a misreading of the modernization theory. Modernization theory, strictly speaking, simply establishes some kind of correlation between a high level of economic development, mostly wealth, and the existence of democratic systems, democratic regimes. It does not tell us that if you have high rates of economic growth, in that process, you're going to democratize dictatorship. I would say that modernization theory really gives us a puzzle, and the puzzle has not really been solved. But when you re-examine the modernization theory, you would find a lot of limitations of applying the level of economic development to the understanding of how countries would become democratic. I think most seriously is that it does not tell us how. That is, how the modernization process could lead to political democratization. Thankfully, in the last 30 years, we've seen a lot of scholarly research on how countries become democratic. There were really two contributions that stand out that will help us understand how countries become democratic, and it will also help us why dictatorship has persisted in China despite 4 decades of really rapid economic growth. The first one is that when we look at how countries actually become democratic, the most important role is played by political elites. That is, leaders in a dictatorship must somehow, for all different reasons, must be willing to withdraw from power. That is the most important condition. Once they made the decision, then democratization can occur. So that is but when you apply this rule to China, then after 1980s in China, you can make a plausible argument that some leaders within the Chinese Communist Party, especially Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, did want to take China in a much more liberal, open direction. But that is not the case. That was not the case after Tiananmen. After Tiananmen, Chinese leaders were dominated by conservatives, and they had no inclination to open up the political system. So that condition did not exist, and that could probably explain why the Chinese Communist Party has maintained the power. The other contribution was that when scholars look at what level countries would become democratic, they found that there was no linear correlation. What this means is they did not find that a sort of a given increase in wealth would increase the probability of a country becoming democratic. This doesn't happen. So a country at 1,000 levels per capita income and a country at 2,000 levels, $2,000 per capita income, the probability of becoming democratic, there's no difference. The only difference, that is, when a country becomes democratic, the most powerful factor is that the dictatorship itself has to fall. Coup, revolution, reform. So, in other words, if you count on economic development alone, you're unlikely to achieve democratic breakthrough. So that is so the modernization theory. So when you look at China, as I said just now, because the Chinese ruling elites have been consistently and very openly opposed to any political change or reforms that would end or endanger one-party rule. Economic reform in China really cannot lead to democracy on its own. Another thing about China's on this issue is that can you actually reform a totalitarian regime into democracy? This is a much more theoretical issue. When you look at history of democratization around the world, you'll find this very striking phenomena. That is, authoritarian regimes, not totalitarian regimes, there are critical differences between these two regime types. Authoritarian regimes can actually reform or transition into democracy. Lots of cases, Taiwan, Korea, Indonesia, Spain, Brazil, Mexico, lots of them. But totalitarian regimes, you really don't find a very successful case. Now, what you will say, what about Eastern Europe? Eastern European regimes were externally imposed totalitarian regimes, so they really don't count. Once the Soviet Union withdrew military support, these regimes could not survive. Now, the most interesting case was the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet Union tried to reform. Gorbachev tried to turn this empire from a totalitarian regime into a sort of democratizing regime, but the process failed. It led to a revolution that overthrew totalitarian regime. So today, I think a really important scholarly topic is to research whether this kind of regime is reformable. My guess is this is something I think scholars need to focus on in the future, is that it's very difficult to reform a totalitarian regime. The problem with totalitarian regime is that they're very, very strong if they do not, if they maintain all the features of totalitarian: control of economy, control of information, control of the security forces. But once they start reform, things just fall apart. That's because in the totalitarian regime, the party controls everything. And when you start reforming this kind of regime, you actually attack the party's authority, legitimacy, and in many cases, you have to bring up the party's past and that can cause a rapid loss of legitimacy. And then instead of reforming that kind of system, you cause a revolution, and that was the case of the Soviet collapse. So for China, Chinese leaders, they've looked at Soviet collapse and they've concluded that reform is political suicide. So they're not going to do it. I think at one level, they're right. This kind of system, once you reform, it's very likely to lead to revolution. But at the same time, they are trapped in a system that ultimately will not survive because that system has all kinds of internal flaws or contradictions. So that's why economic reform in China, our economic development in China over the last 45 years has not really given us political democracy. That, to sum up, that is both a function of the decisions made by Chinese elites, but also it has a lot to do with the nature, with the fragility of totalitarian system as a whole. So now finally, so let's just deal with the last question. How come that 40 plus years of engagement between China and West would end in a Cold War? Well, to start, I think there were disputes about whether today we have a Cold War, new Cold War. Some would call this strategic competition. Some would call this a new Cold War. I think if you have to choose, it's a spectrum. I think the reality probably is closer to the new Cold War than to strategic competition. I would really sort of use realism to explain this. A very famous theory in international relations posits that the rise of a new power would disrupt or fundamentally change the balance of power in the international system, and it will cause a major disruption of the international order, and that process itself would engender great power rivalry, if not great power conflict. I think there's a lot sort of truth to this, because when you look at today's sort of a conflict between China and the US, most of it is about power. Some of this is about ideology. But I think to understand how China, a country that has benefited more than any other country in the last 40 years from engagement with the West, from globalization, how come its leaders would consistently resist being integrated into a Western-led economic and political order? So in the book, I specifically look at Chinese leaders' perspectives on international relations and their ideological interpretation of international relations. What I found is that it was very difficult. Of course, the Western leaders had some naive ideas about integrating China, but Chinese leaders were never naive about the game they were playing. First, even when they were benefiting from the West-led international order, they did not accept its legitimacy. Deng Xiaoping said, 1989, the international order, we would seek to establish a new international economic order, a new new international political order. So he was very, very clear, and his successors also said something about the international order being unjust, being unreasonable. So there was, and the other thing is, so first they consistently rejected the West-led international order. Second, it's really about China's position in the world. China was a great power, but after missing the Industrial Revolution, it fell on hard times. Uh, so the so-called Century of Humiliation, 1840 to 1949, China was a failed state. China lost its influence in the international community, and Deng Xiaoping and his successors were intent on making China great again. So they saw China as a great power. They saw East Asia as part of the domain in which China should be dominant. So that self-conception of Chinese power and China's international role will also conflict with the West. So at the intellectual ideological level, you could say that conflict between China and the West was a likely outcome once China becomes powerful enough to challenge the international order, and then powerful enough to assert its influence or to regain or reclaim its influence in the international system. So this is at two levels. Uh, uh, Perspective on the global order, perspective on its international position. And another, at the third level, is really about sort of how the Chinese Communist Party itself sees the outside world for reasons that really need to be re-examined much more deeply. Throughout this process, throughout China's reform and opening, the Communist Party had consistently, and I would say genuinely, believed that the West was trying to change China through peaceful evolution. And they were also quite genuinely hostile to democracy. I think at some level, they could be right because I think the West did hope that economic change in China would make China more liberal. Right? I think but when you look at the actual activities, policies, or initiatives, it's actually very hard to find this grand conspiracy being implemented with real policy or measures. So this paranoia uh, reinforced, I would say, the previous two elements, that is, a hostile attitude toward the international order and a much more realist, a much more ambitious agenda for reestablishing China's position in the world. So if you sort of keep these factors in mind, then I think you would have to conclude that opening was mainly an instrument, was done for very pragmatic reasons to regain China's power and influence. And it was temporary. It was not permanent. Uh, as long as opening worked to China's advantage, China would do it. But once opening stopped being a useful tool to revive China's to help regain China's influence, or even worse, if opening made China vulnerable to the outside world, then China would reject opening, would retreat from opening. I think we've seen this in the last decade. When you put everything together, the revival of authoritarian rule at home, and also the breakdown of engagement with the West. Uh, uh, these two outcomes have both systemic reasons, that is the nature of the Chinese system, and also personal reasons. Deng Xiaoping's views, Deng Xiaoping's policies and Xi Jinping's views and Xi Jinping's policies. So what we face today is really a historic tragedy of epic proportions, because I think had China been a very different, had China been governed by a very different regime, we're not going to see a world that is headed toward great power, rivalry, the breakdown of an international order that has really worked very well for roughly 70, 80 years. Okay, I will end here and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pei. Thank you, Minxin. This was really wonderful, and I have my copy of the book, and I've just started reading it, so it's a real luxury to be able to chat with the author in real time as I grapple with these ideas. I want to, as always, invite everybody to jump into the chat with any questions. And actually, before I jump into mine, I'll thank Marco Lalama for joining us, and I'll share his question here. How is state control enforced on Chinese tourists that travel abroad and are exposed to Western liberal ideas and practices? This is interesting. This is the sort of Chinese police stations around the world. How is state control enforced on Chinese tourists that travel abroad and are exposed to Western liberal ideas and practices? Thanks, Marco.
Yeah. Okay. I think the coverage of so-called Chinese overseas police stations probably exaggerates the extent and coverage scope of China's security presence. I think what they do when they do control, they control from within China because the police issues passports, and Chinese people tend to be quite afraid to defy government orders or regulations. So right now, there's this dispute between China and Japan over Taiwan, and the Chinese government said, "Oh, it's very dangerous to travel to Japan," which I think is totally untrue. But if Chinese tourists want to go there, they have to worry about whether their passports could be renewed or uh, invalidated. And because a lot of Chinese tourists go to Japan through tour groups, tour agencies, and Chinese tour agencies, their license can be taken away. So they have to cancel and refund their customers. So I think it's still pretty easy for China to use these tools as diplomatic leverage.
Thanks, Minchin, and thank you, Marco. And Marco, I saw your note. I will follow up with you about that as well, and about future events. I hope to collaborate more. My colleague, Dr. Yaowen Li, is also joining us. Thank you, Yaowen, for joining us. Her question is: Western-style democracy fundamentally incompatible with a cultural tradition shaped by centuries of Confucian-influenced centralized authority in China? And I'm just back from Taiwan, so I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Pei to talk about that, whether Western-style democracy is incompatible with a Confucian tradition.
Yeah, great question. I think this question has been raised repeatedly by scholars who study democracy and who study China. My short answer is it has never been tried. So how do we know whether tried in China? Okay, how do we know that it has not this incompatibility? I think a lot of things we say today are speculative. But when we look at Taiwan, uh, uh, clearly democracy has flourished. When you look at Hong Kong, uh, democracy was suppressed, did not get a real chance. I so, but when you look at sort of at some fundamental levels, you can say this, Chinese people's uh, sort of goals, objectives, preferences are not that fundamentally different from people in the US, Europe. They want personal security. They want equality under the law. They want to have some say about how they are governed. And of course, they would like to have a say in how their tax dollars, tax renminbi, is spent. So to that extent, I think you can offer other institutional arrangements. But so far, democracy seems to be one of the things that could at least deliver some of these results. I'm not saying democracy is a panacea, and democracy is very fragile. All we need to do is to look at the US, look at Europe, uh, uh, and even Japan itself, even Taiwan. You will see that maintaining this form of governance is extremely challenging. Polarization, populism, inequality, and so on and so forth. But compared with dictatorship democracy, is obviously an improvement in many, many respects. The most important one of which is that don't have to live in fear. Once you experience fear, then I think, personally speaking, I really don't want to live in a system uh, that is ruled by fear. And that's the fundamental difference between democracy and a dictatorship.
Thanks, Minxin, and thanks, Yohan, for the question. Um, I'll jump in with a question, and then I do want to let you go at the top of the hour, Minxin. Mine is I keep coming back to this phrase, 摸着石头过河.
Yeah,
And I think Deng Xiaoping wasn't always coming up with these phrases, but he's credited with a lot of very clever ones. Whether it's a black cat or a white
yeah,
cat,
yes,
I just as long as it catches mice. But there's one about 摸着石头过河, the cross the river while feeling for the stones. It's so
yes,
visceral, and you think of crossing a river and you
yes,
can't quite see the bottom, and you're kind of guessing where the
yeah,
stones are that you can step on.
yes,
What he seems to have been implying there was a kind of willingness to improvise, to do
yes,
what works, a kind of really deep pragmatism that superseded any kind of strict
yeah,
ideology. And maybe also somewhere in that is also the jettisoning, as Deng Xiaoping very successfully did, I think, the kind of cult of personality politics that of course Xi Jinping brought back to some extent. But this brings up a question because I'm also reading right now Jennifer Lin's Autocracy 2.0, a new book, another one that just came out, and I think it makes a nice pair actually with your book. Um, and what seems to be the case in her approach of sort of a smart autocracy or smart
yes,
authoritarianism is a very deliberate choice of action, a very deliberate choice of a course of action here, and that also seems to be part of what you're connecting between the economic liberalization as a way to kind of fuel the maintenance of political power and maybe the accrual of political capital through growing the GDP, growing the collective wealth of the country, and people really feeling, of course, in their daily life, a raising standard of living. So connecting those two in a very deliberate way. Um, to what extent? How do you reconcile this idea of 墨着石头过河, the sort of improvisatory aspect of especially early 1980s policy with a sense now 45 years later that there is a clear arc and a clear deliberate policy being enacted here. I'm having trouble squaring those
okay.
two ideas.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the metaphor of crossing the river by feeling for the stones. Uh, I want to make 2 points. First is that when Deng Xiaoping said this, he was thinking strictly in terms of economic change. Um, uh, the shore across the river was a dynamic, efficient economic system. Not necessarily capitalist. If there's something, if there's a series system that would make it, that would produce economic results, then would embrace it because the guy said black cats, white cats, yellow cats, right? So that is clear because it was very confined, a very specific kind of objective. Now, now the post-Tiananmen era is really interesting because in the book there's a chapter on the 1990s. Deng was sort of a conceptual thinker. He knew that one part, in his guts, he felt that economic modernization under one-party rule could succeed, and he was willing to try anything. But uh, uh, the system, the post-Tiananmen system that was developed after the fall of the Soviet Union, was a very different system. Deng did not envision. Deng only provided really rough sketches. It's his successors, like Jiang Zemin, mostly Jiang Zemin, and his colleagues that crossed a different river. Okay, so there were two rivers they crossed. Deng crossed the river to reach an economic system. Jiang and his colleagues, through real experimentation, learning, trial and error, actually developed a new authoritarian system through the 1990s. They learned a lot from uh, the fall of the Soviet Union, and there's a big literature on this in the China field. So they managed to cross the river to reach new authoritarian sort of rule. So if you sort of apply the analogy, then we had, but the problem is now we look at Xi Jinping. Okay, Xi Jinping rose to power in an arguably new authoritarian regime, and he sort of again to sort of further exploit your metaphor of crossing the river. He stood on the other side of the river and said, "No, this is not good. Let's go back." So he went back to where Deng Xiaoping started.
That's a great extension of the metaphor, Minxin. And it brings us right to the top of the hour, and it gives me a lot to think about. The idea that he crossed the one river and said, "I'm going." I liked it better on the other side. Um, that's really terrific. The book is wonderful. I've shared it several times in the chat. I recommend that everybody get a copy. And I know a few of you have already sent me a note. And hopefully you'll be the lucky few who get a free copy if you'd like. I have a couple, but do check out the Amazon and also the Princeton University Press website. Both have the book, especially for such a brand new academic book, at a really wonderful price point, right around that $20 to $30 range. So thank you, Minxin, for joining. Thanks. I see Jim and Mike and Yawen, and nice to meet you remotely, Marco, and great to see some students joining as well. We will continue in the spring. This is our last event for the fall. I really went out with a bang here with my friend and neighbor from Claremont McKenna College, Dr. Pei Minxin. Minxin, it's always great to talk with you, and I'll catch up with you again next week.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.